This November, help decide our city's future. Flip your ballot over to vote yes or no on 3 questions from the Racial Justice Commission. Learn more at nyc.gov/racial justice. Early voting begins October 29th and Election Day is November 8th. Paid for by the City of New York.
Hello, and welcome to this special program on the 3 racial justice proposals that would appear on the ballot in this 2022 general election. My name is Lucia Gomez. I'm the political director of the New York City Central Labor Council. This election, New York voters will have the opportunity to vote on 3 racial justice questions to amend the city's constitution. Today, we'll tell you what you should know about these 3 proposals and why it's important that you vote and that you do not leave the questions blank. Flip that ballot. Aside from those 3 racial justice questions, all New Yorkers throughout the state of New York will have one additional question on the ballot, one specifically around climate change. But today, we'll be discussing the 3 racial justice questions that only residents and voters in the city of New York will have the opportunity to vote. Today, we welcome Commissioner Anna Bermúdez, Commissioner of the New York City Department of Probation and a member of the Racial Justice Commission, Melissa Mark-Viverito, former New York City Council Speaker, and Grace Bonilla, President and CEO of United Way of New York City. welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So we're going to talk specifically about these 3 ballot questions, right? While my intuition says start with number 1, it is going to be number 2, technically, on the ballot. So why, right? Let's just start before laying out those 3. And I'm sure Anna, and I'm going to point to Anna, who's the commissioner on the commission, right? Why these 3 questions? What are they? Right? And why did the Racial Commission come up with these 3 specific questions?
Well, there's also good to start with the background of why this was even created, right? So in 2020, after the death of George Floyd and the movement towards racial justice, then Mayor Bill de Blasio created this commission to look into our charter, which is essentially the Constitution of the City of New York. To see whether there were areas that, things that were missing that would promote racial justice and equity, or whether there were things there that were getting in the way of such things, right? And so the commission was formed, 11 commissioners, a very diverse group of folks. 3 of us were Latino, and then we held forums, town halls. We, did some research. We had, all sorts of meetings to come up with 3 potential amendments to the charter. And then another one of the ballot questions will be around the cost of living of New York, right? So to your question, there's three questions to be answered by voters by flipping the ballot. You have to, they're in the back. You'll see the candidates in the front, flip it over, and you'll see the questions. And those are whether there should be a preamble to the charter with a statement of values of equity and racial justice. Number 2 would be the creation of a permanent Office of Equity and Racial Justice for the City of New York. And then number 3 would be to calculate the true cost of living for city residents.
And that question number 2 has a couple of additional components, right?
Yes.
The creation of a Racial Justice Commission that would advise that agency, as well as a production of a report of compilation of data,
correct,
right, that will be acquired throughout the city. Melissa, you've been in public service for a very long time, right? Our ex-speaker of the New York City Council had a position of leadership to really drive different pieces of legislation. Why is this different? Why is these questions presented to the voters different than, let's say, what a council member can do, or let's say what the mayor, can do by the creation of an office?
Well, I mean, when a mayor does an executive action, or when even legislation is passed, right, that can always be revoked, right? But when you're talking about amending the city charter, when you're talking about making sure that the Constitution of the City of New York, which basically talks about how should the city be structured, how should the government be structured, and the roles and responsibilities of each, right? Defines what the mayor does, defines what the city council does, what the controller does. Now this is actually asking the people, which that Constitution basically looks over, right? and to then determine what they want in it and out. That's why this voting process is so important. So we're asking people to say, yes, I want that amendment that now is going to create this Office of Racial Equity.
Or no.
So, right.
Or no, if
it's
that's
a right.
their choice.
It's a yes or no. And if it is created, right, then that language is now inserted into the city charter, and it cannot be changed or altered by whoever is in office, right? It can be revoked, as opposed to an office that a mayor sets up. The next mayor could decide they don't want that office to exist and stops funding it. So this is very much it's directing the way government will be structured if it's voted in favor. And the cost of living is kind of part of that, where you're talking about, we all know living in New York is expensive, but when you're talking about really evaluating what that cost is, when you talk about a family, for instance, what does it cost to raise a child in the city of New York? Now you're talking about childcare costs. You're talking about additional educational resources that a family needs to educate their child, et cetera. Getting a real sense of what that cost is, if people vote in favor of that happening, then it's also going to be able to direct public policy in the city of New York. It's going to be able to say, well, these are communities that don't have enough resources. We know there are more children in this community, yet the amount of resources for childcare are not enough, right? It can really direct public policy. So I think it's really different and unique. And now that it's going to be embedded within the Constitution of the City of New York, it's basically, if this goes forward, it's saying that this is what our value system is going to be. It's a moral compass question now about what is it that guides the City of New York.
Grace, you're the CEO and president now of United Way, right? A huge institution and a known organization throughout the city of New York. You also headed up the Commission on Human Services, right? Human Services Commissioner. And I know Commissioner Bermúdez mentioned, why the commission, right? What sparked it? But can you give us a little bit more background as to some of the other things that we saw in the last couple of years that demonstrated inequalities in the city?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone that we live in a segregated city. And anecdotally, we can talk about how things feel in Brownsville or South Jamaica or East Harlem. But the reality is that once the pandemic happened, all of those things surfaced. The inequality of our city surfaced to the top. And we saw, as part of what we were trying to do to respond to the crisis and to the pandemic, that there was already another pandemic brewing in our city. And that was one of poverty and racial inequality. And the 27 neighborhoods that we identified early on as the 27 neighborhoods that had the most deaths, had the most hospitalizations, lost the most small businesses, are the same 27 neighborhoods that historically have been under-resourced and underfunded. So the reason that at this moment, this is such an important piece is because I agree with Melissa and with Anna. This is an opportunity for New Yorkers to say, that's it, no más, right? We are not going to allow our city to be segregated in this way, and we need to know where resources need to go. So it is about our values. It's about having an office that can look across our city agencies and say, let's look at this from a different lens, right? We look at it from the lens of aging. We look at it from the lens of children. We look at it from the lens of language access. Now we want to really understand what are the systemic racism that exists in our agencies so that we can get rid of them. And finally, the true cost of living is so important from an advocacy perspective. If we don't have the information, we really can't do anything about advocating for a city as a whole. It's not even about one group versus another. It's what the city as a whole needs to recover from the pandemic and to thrive. So it's an important piece that throughout my career I've seen that we are in the same neighborhoods all the time, and we need to change that paradigm.
And I think that also, when you think about the creation of this commission and what motivated it, right, that reckoning that we came into as a country, right, around the murder of George Floyd. And that idea that there are these systemic injustices, right, that are deeply embedded in government and in the institutions that serve us, supposed to serve us. And so really taking us as a city, right, to say that to the commission when it was charged, take a look at the charter, take a look at this reality that exists and what can we do as a city to change it. And let's then take it to the voters to decide if that's something that they want us to continue to do and basically embed that now in the Constitution. So it really is the most democratic process, right? Where you're talking about altering such an important document, but now it's the people that have to make that decision. So we're here to kind of raise awareness, right, about this, what led to it, get people to know the consequences. They vote yes, this is what happens, right? If you vote no, nothing happens. So that people can then make that decision, vote, and then, and then figure out the next steps that we would take as a city to address those systemic injustices. So it's really great to see this happening.
I mean, there's a fact, right? Aside from the fact that New Yorkers don't turn out to vote in high numbers, right? Low turnout means only a small segment of the community, a small segment of New York City will have a say on whether or not these questions go into place or, we continue status quo. So definitely on one of my, biggest pitches every time is don't forget to turn out to vote. If you don't vote, and if you don't flip the ballot to make a decision, right, to say yes or no on these questions, then someone else will decide for you, and a small segment, approximately only like 25, 26% of the city ever turns out, maybe during these general elections because there's statewide, candidates on the ballot as well, goes up a little. There's always an uptick during, these off-year election cycles. But the reality is that a lack of not voting also yields to decision being made, kind of on your behalf.
In your absence.
In your absence. And, unfortunately, we can see that this democratic process that the commission intentionally is putting forward towards the voters to decide means that only a small segment, if you do not flip that ballot, right, and vote on these questions, could be decided by a small number of people. You served on the commission. You had an opportunity to hear the different things that community members, during the open meetings and the public meetings. What were some of those, stories that you heard and some of the ways in which these questions are trying to address those things?
One of the hardest parts of being on the commission was that it was almost overwhelming, the feedback that we were getting. So actually to distill all of it into 3 very actionable things right now is kind of only the beginning, honestly, because and it has to, and that's why it's so important. The office in particular, right? Because
question number 2.
Question number 2, because we have to keep it in our front and center consciousness all the time, because over and over we were being asked questions like, why does X, Y, or Z have to happen or not happen in my neighborhood? Right? I don't see, the environmental, justice, for example, issues came up. There were all sorts of other, issues that were raised by various communities. Land trusts, for example, community land trusts. Those were like big, issues that were raised. And how to keep other areas of government accountable to injustice, to equity. And so it was really very intense and really important. So we heard so much from the public. We need the public also to go vote so that your voice is heard. It does matter. It does matter what you say at the ballot.
The preamble, right? This Declaration of Values. A lot of us read the U.S. Constitution, right? We know what the forefathers intended. Does the current charter not have intentions, values, goals of what the city of New York is actually about?
Well, it's a more, it's more rigid document in terms of like the structure of government. It doesn't have that. That's why people are being asked. But think about and I think sometimes we don't realize that we even have a city charter, right? We have a city charter, we have a state charter, we obviously have the federal constitution. And the federal constitution has been amended many times, right? So now we're talking about any change to the document that directs the way government functions here in New York needs to and should be going to a vote. It's a consultative, collaborative process. And I'm a big believer that we should be looking for mechanisms to encourage greater civic participation, not less. But I think particularly for communities that historically have been marginalized in this city and in society, this is really important to be present and to not leave those questions blank, right? And to at least, show that you were engaged with them and that you took some sort of decision. And I think that that's what we're trying to do through this educational campaign.
I think that question number 1 pretty much just allows language that directs the city, right, to be intentional and purposeful with, their, programming, their usage of resources to ensure that every part of the city would in fact, is impacted in the same way, right, in the same measure, and that we don't have 27 neighborhoods that rise to the top as being, most impacted by a global pandemic, because unfortunately those things are still fresh, and we still see what the pandemic has done to our neighborhoods and to our communities, and we at a minimum want to make sure that the city has a statement of values that tells the residents of New York, this is what the city is about, right? So first, we have that question, which is about the preamble and declaration, of values. Now, that second question, just to make sure folks are clear, that second question would create, in fact, an entire agency, a commission, an agency of racial justice, right? That would be responsible in gathering the information from over 100 and some odd city agencies in the entire city. Right, aside from that, what else will that commission be responsible with and tasked with?
So, there would be a yearly report on data of all the agencies involved. So let me give you an example. The public will be able to see. So, for example, a lot of our city agencies have lots of data. We have lots of data.
Yes, we have open data.
But for example, it's not disaggregated
Right.
By race.
On any equity lenses, right? So for example, I'm also currently the commissioner of the Department of Probation, and one of the things that the MMR, the Mayor's Management Report, has us report on is recidivism rates, right? But that's not, for example, by neighborhood. And so we have the same situation. The 7 communities that have been most continue to be from the 1970s to today by the justice involvement they're the same year after year, and not surprisingly on the list of most impacted by COVID, right? So what are we doing in those communities? My agency should
How
be
are we
held
directing resources? How are we directing
right?
attention?
So attention to those communities to make them stronger and not continue the pattern of justice involvement, right? So that's what it would do across the board with all the agencies, and provide resources, because agencies, some are big, some are small, and it would hopefully provide resources to help us sift through that and be able to address inequities much better.
And the reality is that we look at census data, those of us that are continuously looking at the data, we know, Grace, and you said it, and I was like, absolutely, the city's segregated. Let's be real.
Our schools are segregated.
Our schools are
We know that.
segregated. The opportunities are segregated, right? Like essentially, we're talking about a city, tons of zip codes, tons of neighborhoods, tons of dynamics that the community themselves don't see. You live day by day, living your life. You don't see yourself from that, in that reality, right? Some folks don't even know how segregated the entire city is. I know the CUNY Data Center does tons of maps that we can see, and it is crystal clear. We just went through the redistricting process, or in the process of that process, and we saw how segregated and how impactful that is for one who lives in the city to see, the way in which their communities live. Now tell me, this true cost of living, which is question number 3, right? We got the data, right? We have the statement of values. Let's go. Every agency is required to live by those standards. Then we have this commission, this agency that's created, and a body that oversees that agency, right, to make sure that all these things are being addressed and the data that's produced in the report. Now we have this true cost of living that is created based on what now we've captured, so that all of a sudden, New York City says, this is what it really means. This is how much it costs to live here. And essentially, potentially even, geographically, right? How much it costs to live in the Bronx versus how much it costs to live in Brooklyn, and different parts of Brooklyn, and different parts, of Queens and Staten Island, right? Melissa, tell me, how valuable could that piece of information be? This number, these numbers that tell us how much it costs to live in the city. Like, how does this change public policy, or not just change specifically? How can it be used to change?
Well, I mean, look, I think that it's incredibly important. let's just say that, right? When you think about, and I remember when I was a council member, that there was an advocacy group that always would approach us with this, look, we've developed this tool, right, that measures the cost of living. So as a policymaker, you see that and you say, wait a minute, to live in New York City, in order to have a quality of life,
Right.
this is at minimum what the salary would have to be of a person maybe with one child, or a single person, or a person with two children, right? That it's really jarring, because then you realize like we're way really not even close to meeting that, right? So it can start pushing you in terms of changing the public policy. It could maybe advocate to increase the minimum wage, right? To advocate to put more resources into childcare services, or make universal childcare, right? We know
Make more affordable housing in certain neighborhoods.
So it does really, get you focused on looking at what you can do to arrive at a place where people can have a quality of life, regardless of your circumstance. And I think that at the end of the day, with the plan of the commission, the way I see it and view it, is that it's trying to change the organizational culture of how New York City operates, right? Because now you're going to be, if again these measures do pass, the vision is like to change the way that these agencies, what they center their work on. The work is not going to be centered on equity and justice, right? And looking at where does the inequities exist, and then being very conscious about it and deliberative and intentional, about the work that you do. So if people vote in favor, that's potentially, right, the consequences of that vote. If people decide that they don't want to vote in favor, then we just keep operating the way we're operating. So,
I think this is, think about this, right? We have the first question, the preamble and the Declaration of Values. We have the second question about the creation of an agency and the monitoring of city agencies. But let's be real, that third question, at least for someone that works in, with labor unions, with workers, right?
And a policy wonk.
And a data, loving it all. Grace, you work in the, I would say, private sector, right? With nonprofit organizations delivering services and being able to understand who needs these services. This information is not just going to be for internal consumption, correct? It's not just for the delivery of city services. It is not just for, to advise the mayor or the council members or all other policymakers and commissioners about what the city looks like and how, what the impact has been of all the resources that we spend every day. But who else is it going to impact?
Well, when I look at the three ballots, it's really our values, accountability, and then information, right? And what we do with that information is going to be after a number of different sectors. You're talking about the labor sector, who could say, wait a minute, this is the true cost of living for my members, right? We're talking about government, who could say, wait, we need to right-size these contracts so that people are having a dignity of life. And the reality is that a lot of our nonprofits also have relationships in the corporate sector, who could say, listen, if you're going to do business in New York City, this is what people need to make. This is the bare minimum to have a dignified living situation in New York City. So it could impact a number of different areas. Mainly, the reason I'm excited by this is that a lot of organizations have come together throughout the ages. Melissa pointed it out, right? Saying like, this is what I think the true cost of living is. This is what I think it is. And it varies. Now we're saying the city of New York is putting a stake in the ground.
Is responsible
and accountable to New Yorkers to say, this is what it takes to live in the city, and this is the lens by which we're going to do business with corporations, we're going to do business internally as a city, and how we're going to look at resources in a different way. So it's an exciting moment, but regardless of where you fall on the excitement about this moment, just turn the ballot. Just vote, have your voices heard, and I think that's what matters in this moment.
And the reality is that individuals that, wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to fight so that we have these rights, so that we have the opportunity to live with respect and dignity in the largest city in the country, the largest city in the world. New York City, it could be a leader in establishing these kinds of components within their structure to ensure that we no longer have the highest poverty rates, the highest crime rates, the highest this. And if you disaggregate this by neighborhood, it gets worse, right? And I think ultimately that is the question. So if you live in certain neighborhoods, there's an implication that if you live in that neighborhood, you'll have less services, you'll have less opportunities to attain, jobs or college entrance. It is really, and we haven't had the chance to really dig in deep and disaggregate this. Tons of us do, right? That do policy for a living, that love, being able to identify racial inequality. But now we need to fight to improve these things. And it seems to me, at least from what I'm understanding, that it would be a step towards kind of lifting that veil over the inequality in a way that allows all New Yorkers, all individuals that do business in the city of New York to say, this is what the people of New York need. And understanding how they live is going to be critical. Is there anything else that you want to share to the viewers of this program so that they understand how to go about ensuring that their voice is heard at the ballot box?
Yeah, they got to flip
November
the ballot.
8th.
That's what they got to do.
Show up
Flip the
and then
ballot.
flip the ballot.
And October 29th starts early voting. So, now more than ever, for all those that fought hard to ensure that folks had more of a chance to be able to turn out to vote. October 29th starts early voting up until Sunday, November 6th. And then folks on November 8th from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. have an opportunity to show up at their polling locations and vote. Right. So I want to thank you all for being with us to kind of dissect, all those three ballot measures. This has been a very interesting conversation. I think, in fact, all of our communities are just going to have a chance to be able to say it's not about electing an individual, it is now about having a real say of what the future of New York could look like, once they engage and flip that ballot and vote on these ballot measures. So
Absolutely.
I want to thank you all for being with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
New York is our city, and this November, your vote will help decide our future. The Racial Justice Commission proposed 3 changes to our city's charter, its constitution. Flip your ballot over to vote yes or no on, adding a statement of values that promotes justice and equity for all New Yorkers, creating an office to support and advance those values, and measuring the true cost of living. Learn more at nyc.gov/racialjustice. Use your voice and be sure to vote this November. Early voting begins October 29th, and Election Day is November 8th. Paid for by the City of New York.